Superstitions ran deep even among the elite. Some placed religious relics by their beds, or charms sewn into their pillows, believing it would protect them from nightmares, demons, or death in sleep. These fears were not baseless. Plague, sudden, illness, and fire could strike in the night. For many nobles, each sleep could be their last. The servants' quarters, beneath the bed, it wasn't just nobles in the room. Chambers, especially in castles, often had sleeping areas for multiple people. A maid might sleep in a narrow trundle bed that rolled under the main bed. Pages or young boys might sleep on benches or in adjoining corridors. These servants had to remain alert, ready to fetch hot stones, wine, or a chamber pot at their master's whim. And those pots. Yes, toilets were not a nightly affair. Most people, regardless of status, used chamber pots or close stools, small portable toilets kept near the bed. These were emptied in the morning by servants. Even the queen herself wasn't spared from needing one. Some castles had garderobes, vertical shafts carved into the stone walls, emptying into moats or pits below. But walking down a cold hallway at 2 a.m. wasn't always appealing. So, most chose the pot. It's strange to think, the same hand that signed royal edicts also held a chamber pot in the dark. Interrupted sleep. What kept nobles awake? The poor weren't the only ones with segmented sleep. Nobles too experienced first and second sleep, and often used the night watch period for quiet activities, reading if literate, meditating, or writing letters by candlelight. But the night was also filled with sound. Castles creaked, guards called to one another, dogs barked, servants moved through halls, wind howled through narrow windows, dripping water echoed from the stone. Some nobles were tormented by sin, demons, or an imbalance of humors. Physicians might prescribe opiates, wine, or warmed milk with herbs. More dangerously, others turned to lead-based cosmetics or mercury-laced ointments believed to induce sleep. The side effects were horrific. Still, most simply endured. If you couldn't sleep, you waited. Perhaps you prayed. Perhaps you paced. Perhaps you simply stared into the darkness and thought, the final sleep. Dying in bed, it was considered a good death to die in your bed. Nobles, especially, hoped to die in their chambers, surrounded by priests, family, and servants. Deathbeds were places of ritual, confession, forgiveness, the final breath. Beds were even passed down in wills. Not just the furniture, but the bedding, the hangings, the feather-stuffed cushions. A good bed might last generations. So imagine, lying in your feather-filled velvet-draped canopy bed, staring up at wooden beams darkened with soot and years. The smell of lavender and old wine still lingers in the curtains. You know others have slept and died here before you. And you wonder, was their sleep any better than yours? Or did they too lie awake, scratching at lice and listening to rats in the walls? The medieval night is deep now. You've heard the scratching, the murmurs, the whistle of wind through shutter cracks. Whether you're a peasant curled under a patchy blanket or a noblewoman nestled behind velvet curtains, you've come to understand something essential. Sleep, in the Middle Ages, was not a comfort, it was a battleground, a place of fears and faith, hardship and habit, a liminal space between labor and death. As we close this story, we explore what the final hours of the day meant to a world both distant and intimately familiar. Night was not quiet, if we imagine the medieval world at night as peaceful, quiet villages resting under starlight, castles hushed in slumber. We miss something important. Medieval nights were full of noise. Dogs barked. Roosters sometimes crowed at the wrong hour. In towns, taverns stayed open deep into the dark, and laughter or violence spilled into narrow alleys. In cities, night watchmen walked the streets with lanterns, calling the hour aloud. Church bells rang for late-night prayers or the death of a soul. Even in remote hamlets, the forest whispered, owls hooted, wolves howled, and travelers passed quietly or not. And inside homes, sleepers coughed, children whimpered, adults rose for the privy, firewood cracked in the hearth, rats scurried across beams. For most, sleep was not absolute silence. It was porous, a light doze between tasks, a fragile rest broken often and resumed without complaint. Sleeping through fear in a world without locks. Night was dangerous. Doors were often just wooden boards barred with beams. Windows, if there were any, were little more than holes covered by shutters or animal hides. Bandits, soldiers, or hungry neighbors might knock, or worse, not knock at all. Even supernatural fears ran high. It wasn't uncommon for medieval people to sleep with charms under their pillows, or crucifixes by the bed. Candles blessed on Candlemas were kept for storms or evil dreams. Some placed knives beneath the mattress, blade facing outwards meant to ward off spirits. Dreams weren't random. They were messages, often divine or infernal. The church taught that sleep made you vulnerable not only to demons, but to yourself. Lustful dreams, especially, were considered sinful, even involuntary ones. Monks confessed them, noble women prayed against them. Even peasants believed certain foods, like too much garlic or onions, could inflame the senses and disturb the soul. Night, therefore, was a place of moral uncertainty, and yet, everyone still slept. The role of sleep in religion and belief in Christian Europe. sleep was often metaphorically tied to death. Christ himself spoke of sleep when referring to Lazarus. To die in your bed, after a final confession and blessing, was considered the ideal end. As such, many beds were constructed with crosses carved into their frames or religious symbols sewn into the linen. Church records include prayers specifically written to be said before bed. Children were taught to say, "If I should die before I wake," long before it became a nursery rhyme. Some wealthy nobles even commissioned deathbed portraits while still alive, paintings of them lying peacefully in bed, surrounded by saints and angels. But while religion comforted many, it didn't provide warmth. A saint might guard your dreams, but your sleep still belonged to the lice. Beds as inheritance because they were expensive and essential. Beds were passed down like property. In surviving wills from the 13th to 15th centuries, beds appear frequently. One might bequeath my feather bed and all its coverlets to my daughter, Margaret, or the great bed in the upper chamber to my eldest son. Sometimes, entire bedchambers were transferred as symbols of power. In noble families, receiving someone's bed was a sign of deep trust or status. These weren't simply places to sleep, they were family heirlooms. And yes, even if someone had died in them, the bed stayed. A good frame could last a century. A set of sheets might be patched and handed down more than once. You didn't throw things away lightly in the Middle Ages, not even a mattress where death had visited, which means most people slept in second-hand deathbeds. Children, sleep, and survival children had an even more precarious experience with sleep. Infant mortality was painfully high. A baby was often swaddled tightly and placed in a cradle near the hearth or in bed between parents, increasing the risk of accidental suffocation. Poor families rarely had separate rooms, so children grew up watching adult routines from a very young age. Sleep training didn't exist. If the baby cried, they cried. If they slept, everyone was thankful. One curious tradition, found in some parts of medieval England and France, involved placing a small iron key under a child's pillow meant to lock the mouth of evil spirits. Even when asleep, children were watched over by fear. But sometimes, they were a source of fear too. Medieval folklore includes tales of changelings, demonic or fairy impostors who took the place of real children during the night. Such beliefs were born from real tragedies. A baby who suddenly fell ill or failed to thrive might be declared a changeling to ease the grief. And so sleep became a haunted place for parents, for children, for all. The end of night, waking to labor by the 14th and 15th centuries. As towns grew and trade increased, the pace of life began to change. Candle making, clock towers, and merchant schedules shifted how people experienced night and day. Sleep. Second sleep tradition persisted into the early modern period, but eventually faded with the rise of artificial light and stricter work hours. Still, in the countryside, many kept old rhythms. You'd rise with the cock's crow, eat a bit of leftover pottage, and head to the fields. Your bed, however humble or grand, would go cold again until dusk. No snooze button, no morning tea, just work. Sleep was not rest, it was a short reprieve from obligation, and if you didn't get enough, you went on anyway. Because that was the rhythm of life in the Middle Ages. Wake, work, ache, and sleep on straw, under wool, surrounded by noise, and maybe, on rare occasions, peace. Final thoughts. The legacy of sleep today. We treat sleep as a form of self-care. We have temperature-regulated mattresses, blackout curtains, soothing playlists, and sleep consultants. But underneath all this modern comfort is a very human truth. We are still trying to find peace in the night. The medieval world didn't lack effort, it lacked means. But people still made their beds, shared warmth with family or dog, said prayer, and hope just like we do for one good night. So tonight, as you tuck into your own bed, hopefully free of lice and damp straw, spare a moment for those who came before you. The men and women who slept in smoke-filled huts, in stone towers, or on dirt floors. They too counted the hours. Rinse your hands, a minstrel might play, a juggler might entertain, but this was not gluttony, it was ritual. Each meal was meant to reflect your status, your piety, your generosity. Guests were chosen carefully, knights, clerics, trusted allies. Eating at the Lord's table was an honor, but also a test. If you spilled wine or reached too far, you might not be invited again. Table manners mattered. You didn't cut meat for yourself. It was carved by a servant, often with a blade so fine it was considered a weapon of status. You didn't wipe your mouth on your sleeve. You used a napkin, if one was provided. You didn't burp. You didn't yawn. You listened, you nodded, and you kept your eyes on the Lord's hand, because when it stopped reaching for food, the meal was over. And yet, even nobles ate gruel. Not every meal was a feast. In fact, the majority of noble meals, especially breakfast and evening, humble porridge, flavored with honey or currants, cheese, fresh or aged, bread, finer than the peasants, but still dark and hearty. For nobles, food had to walk a line, enough to show wealth, but not so much as to appear sinful. Gluttony was a sin. The church reminded them often. Overeating, excessive seasoning, dining too long, these were signs of spiritual weakness. Fast days were numerous. Meat was forbidden on Fridays. During Lent, and on dozens of other holy occasions. So fish became essential. Rivers and ponds were stocked with carp and eels. Monks raised them in dedicated fish banza. The truly devout might eat simple meals, even in wealth-bred wine. Vegetables living more like peasants to cleanse the soul. So while the manor's hearth could roast a boar, it could also boil cabbage, just like the village woman at the bottom of the hill. The difference: presentation, feasts, fasting, and the food hierarchy. Some of the grandest meals in the medieval world were not about food at all, they were about power. A coronation feast might last for days. So might a wedding. Tables groaned under roasts, pies, fruit, towers, and spiced wine. Servants paraded dishes in dramatic fashion. Whole peacocks with their feathers reattached, or swans stuffed with other birds. But the guests didn't eat most of it. Much of it was for show. Hierarchy defined the plate. The lord ate the finest cut. His steward ate the shoulder. The knight had soup, the scribe had bread. Servants dined on scraps if anything remained. There were always watchful eyes. Who was offered what, how much, and in what order. These details mattered more than taste. Because food was not just fuel, it was a message. You were welcome, or you were not. You were important, or you were not. A bowl of pottage for a visiting noble said more than a letter. Kitchens as battlefields behind the tapestries and painted walls. The kitchen was a war zone. Servants competed for position. Mistakes were punished. A spilled pot could ruin a feast. A miscounted barrel could mean suspicion, or worse. Some castle kitchens were truly massive, with multiple fireplaces, bakeries, and cold rooms carved into the earth. The cook was not a servant in the background. He was a gatekeeper of favor, a manager of men, a practitioner of medieval chemistry. Herbs were mixed for medicine as well as meals. Broths were brewed not just for taste, but for healing. Chicken, boiled with ginger, might be given to the sick. Bread soaked in milk for those who couldn't chew. The kitchen healed, punished, and sustained. And at centroasted fat-baked apples, crushed time marked the hallways of the rich. Even centro. Later, the walls remember. The quiet meal, but after the feast. After the guests left and the music stopped, some noble families sat alone. A simple dish, no fanfare. Just bread, cheese, and cold wine. A quiet meal with a wife. A whisper from a child. A few quiet bites beneath a painted ceiling. No audience, no servants, just the meal. And for a moment, in that silence, they were not so different from the woman stirring cabbage over an open hearth. They too tasted ash. They too needed warmth. They too went to bed with the taste of barley and salt on their tongue, and wondered, despite all the luxury, did this meal matter? Or was it just another bowl of warm, soft gruel? The day has long ended. The stew has gone cold in the pot, the fire reduced to embers. Whether you were a peasant with cabbage broth or a noble with baked trout, the meal is over. But the story of medieval food doesn't end with the plate. It lingers in customs, in hunger, in the way people lived and died. In this final section, we'll explore how food was more than survival, how it shaped identities, decisions, and destinies. Because in the Middle Ages, what you ate told the world who you were. Food is a mirror of class. Imagine two children. One eats boiled oats with turnips, the other eats the same oats but with milk, dried figs, and a drizzle of imported honey. Same grain, different story. In medieval society, food was the clearest line between classes. Not wealth, not clothes, not speech, but what appeared in your bowl. A knight might eat twice a day. A monk, once. A plowman, maybe 3, but one of those was a crust of bread while walking behind a horse. A lord had variety. A serf had repetition. To eat well was to live well. To eat poorly was just to live. Even where people sat while eating told a story. The lord sat at the head, the steward beside him. Lower ranks down the table. The poor, if invited at all, stood, or waited for scraps. Food established, order and reinforced it daily. Hunger is a normal condition. We often think of famine as exceptional, a disaster. In medieval Europe, it was routine. Bad weather, war or plague, could destroy a harvest. A single summer without sun nor 1 week of untimely rain might ruin a year's grain. Without grain, there was no bread. Without bread, no calories. Without calories, no resistance. In 1315 to 1317, a great famine struck across Europe. Crops failed. Livestock died. People ate bark, acorns, dogs, even the bodies of the hanged. That wasn't a legend. That was recorded. But even outside famine, hunger was ordinary. Most peasants ate below the caloric needs of their labor. Children were stunted. Pregnant women miscarried. Elderly villagers simply wasted away during winter. There was no pantry to raid, no corner store to buy flour. When the bread ran out, it stayed out, and still, people got up. They stirred the pot, they shared what they had. Survival wasn't just about food, it was about each other. Religious rules and rituals, every bite was watched by God, or so they believed. The church regulated eating not just on holy days, but throughout the year. Fasting was frequent. Meat was forbidden on Fridays, during Lent, on saints' days, and dozens of other occasions. That could be over 150 days a year. So people adapted. Fish, eggs, and dairy became loopholes. Special mock meat dishes emerged, eels, sculpted into the shape of pigs, almond milk used in place of cream, but the rules were serious. Breaking a fast could be seen as a moral failure. Monks confessed to eating a piece of cheese. Lords gave alms to excuse indulgent banquets. Even ordinary villagers obeyed. It wasn't just about hunger, it was about discipline, penance, and the soul. Women and food. Behind almost every medieval meal stood a woman. In peasant homes, women made the stew, baked the bread, managed the fire, gathered the herbs, and rationed the flour. They decided how long the gruel could last and who got the last egg. In noble homes, women oversaw kitchens, preserved fruits, managed servants, and prepared for feasts. They wrote recipes into family books and taught daughters how to stretch a barrel of flour through a hard month. Food was one of the few areas where women exercised authority, unseen, but vital. And yet, during famine, they often ate last. There are letters, poems, even legal records that show women giving food to their children, their husbands, or even their neighbors, while they went without. Food told a story of gender, one of sacrifice and control. Food and medicine. To eat was also to heal or harm. Medieval medicine believed in balancing humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Food could influence these. Hot foods like onions or red wine were said to increase heat in the body. Cold foods like cucumber or lettuce reduced it. Doctors prescribed diets to treat almost everything. Sore throat, barley water, melancholy, stewed plums, imbalance of bile, avoid garlic, weakness, strong broth with herbs. Even simple meals were carefully constructed. Bread crusts were dry and hot, milk was cold and moist. Almonds were good for the brain. Nobles might consult physicians for menu planning. Monks might prescribe specific herbs for stomach pain, and if the food didn't work, they blamed the stars. Food and identity travel across medieval Europe, and you're lying in bed, but this bed is not yours. It's made of hay, perhaps some straw. A few wooden planks creak beneath you, and there's a thick woolen blanket covering your body. It smells of smoke, sheep, and old sweat. The air is cold, moist, and very still. A dog is sleeping at your feet, not for companionship, but to help keep you warm. This is not a peasant's worst night. This is simply every night. Welcome to the average medieval bed. In the 14th century, sleep was not just a necessity, it was an ordeal. Far removed from today's memory foam and quiet rooms, sleep in the Middle Ages was a ritual governed by superstition, social status, and, more than anything, discomfort. Let's begin with the basics. The bed itself. The mattress, or lack thereof for most medieval people, beds were little more than sacks filled with straw or hay. These were called pallets. The straw had to be changed regularly though. Regularly in the medieval sense might mean once every few months. As it broke down, it not only became flattened and itchy, but also the perfect nesting place for lice, fleas, and mites. Those who could afford more than a sack of straw might stuff their bedding with wool, feathers, or even dried pea shucks. The nobility, of course, had elaborate canopied beds with carved posts and drapes, not necessarily for luxury, but to trap body heat during bitter winters. But even the best beds were still itchy. Beds were social. Unlike today's private bedrooms, sleeping was often communal. In large households, servants might sleep on floors, benches, or in narrow passageways. Entire peasant families slept in one room, often sharing beds. It was not unusual for 4 or 5 people to sleep in the same bed. Children, parents, perhaps even visiting relatives, all crammed into one space. And it wasn't just humans. Animals played a big part in warmth. Chickens might roost in corners. Pigs might be kept just outside. Cats and dogs often shared sleeping spaces, not because of affection, but because every ounce of warmth mattered. A dog in the bed wasn't a luxury, it was insulation. Layers of cloth, but still cold wool, was the go-to material for warmth. Woolen blankets, cloaks, even the sheets, if any were rough, sometimes reused for years. Linen was rare and expensive. Even nobles, when not in full luxury, had to deal with scratchy, heavy bedding. The fire would be allowed to die down by evening. A central hearth might keep a bit of warmth, but if you slept upstairs in a timber house or in a cold stone chamber, the chill could sink into your bones. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. In parts of northern Europe, stories abounded of babies or elderly people freezing to death overnight, especially during harsh winters. Nightwear, or just daywear, most medieval people didn't have dedicated nightclothes. If you were lucky, you slept in a woolen tunic or chemise. Often, you just wore the same clothes you'd worn that day, minus a belt or outer layer. Peasants might even sleep partially clothed to be ready for any middle-of-the-night emergencies like livestock escaping, or a neighbor knocking about wolves nearby. Nobles sometimes had nightcaps or thick sleeping gowns, but even these were more about practicality than style. The idea of changing into pajamas would have been laughable. Bugs, bites, and the bed mangle. One of the most infamous parts of medieval sleep was the sheer number of pests. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were omnipresent. People knew them well, though they had no idea about disease transmission. It was simply considered part of life. Lice combs were common, so were vinegar washes, fumigation, herbs like lavender or mint, and even bed hangings soaked in pungent oils. One grim tool used in noble houses was the bed mangle, a heavy roller used to flatten and beat the mattress and blankets before sleep, not to fluff it, but to drive out rats and bugs. If that didn't work, they simply slept with them. Why sleep at all? Despite all of this, people needed their rest. But sleep wasn't necessarily the 8-hour block we imagine today. Instead, medieval sleep was segmented. First sleep began a few hours after sundown and lasted until midnight. Then, people often woke up naturally, perhaps to tend the fire, relieve themselves, pray, or even visit neighbors. This wakeful period might last an hour or two. Then came second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This segmented sleep pattern was noted in texts, letters, even church records. It was not abnormal, it was expected. And what happened during the night watch? Many prayed. Some read if they were literate. Others tended to quiet chores. In some towns, midwives or priests might be summoned during these late hours. These nighttime windows were often when births or deaths occurred. So, what did they dream about? Records of medieval dreams are scarce, but religious overtones dominated. Dreams were taken seriously, seen as messages from God or omens. Books like the Dream Book of Daniel were consulted. Nightmares were blamed on demons, poor digestion, or restless spirits. Sometimes, a piece of iron was placed under the pillow to ward off evil. And yet, sleep was a relief, even in its discomfort. For the average medieval person exhausted by long hours of labor, cold winds, and a diet of gruel, bedtime was one of the few times they could be still. But as you lay there in your straw-filled sack, scratching at your skin, listening to the rats in the wall, and your brother's breath beside you, a strange thought begins to settle. If everyone slept like this, what did luxury really mean in the Middle Ages? You might think that nobles draped in silks, served on silver, and cocooned in tapestries, slept in peace. But no. Even behind stone walls and velvet curtains, sleep in the Middle Ages was more about survival than serenity. In this section, we leave behind the peasant's hearth and climb the cold spiral stairs of the castle to peek into the bedrooms of the upper class. The beds may be taller, but the fleas still bite. The bed as a status symbol in noble households. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a statement of wealth. Beds were often the most expensive item in a home, constructed of oak or walnut. Some were towering structures raised high above the floor. A small wooden stool was often required just to climb into them. Curtains hung from wooden or iron ringstick, woven tapestries meant to trap heat and offer privacy. These weren't just decorative in a cold, drafty stone castle. Bed curtains were essential insulation. A noble's bed was their throne at night. It was where they entertained guests, signed documents, gave birth, and sometimes even died. In wealthier circles, one might even own a traveling bed, a collapsible wooden frame with tapestries and bedding that could be carried between manors. The more elaborate the bed, the higher your status. But even here, with cushions stuffed with feathers and wool blankets dyed deep reds or greens, there was no true escape from discomfort. The canopy and curtains. Let's look closer at that beautiful canopy. Originally, it wasn't built for style. It was born out of necessity. Castles where drafty breezes snaked in through arrow slits and between stones. Smoke from central fires gathered in the rafters. A canopy kept falling soot, straw, or even the occasional rodent dropping off the sleeper below. Curtains did more than block wind. They kept out servants' eyes. Even the highest lords and ladies didn't sleep alone. Pages, maids, and chamberlains came and went at all hours. Some nobles even had servants sleeping at the foot of the bed just in case they needed anything at night. So curtains weren't just warm, they were a veil of dignity. Yet for all the layers of fabric and wood, noble beds could be infested just as easily. Lice don't care about status. Bedding and textiles, clean. Sometimes if you were rich, you could afford more sheets, more layers, and more laundering. But even so, regular washing was rare by modern standards. Linen sheets might be washed once every few weeks or months. Mattresses often filled with feathers, moss, or straw were fluffed, aired, and beaten, but seldom replaced. The problem wasn't just filth, it was labor. Washing large textiles meant soaking them in cauldrons of water, wringing them by hand, drying them in the open air, and ironing them with heavy heated stones. It could take days. So even in the best chambers, sheets might carry the scent of weeks-old sweat, perfumes, and smoke. Sometimes, nobles sprinkled herbs, lavender, sage, or rosemary between sheets to mask odors or repel insects. They slept in scent, but not in cleanliness. Nighttime attire and rituals. Noblemen and women sometimes had more specialized sleepwear. Rich ladies wore long linen shifts or nightgowns, while men might wear nightshirts. Both genders often wore nightcaps, not for fashion, but to trap body heats. Hair, especially for women, was braided or wrapped to prevent tangling. Some nobles even slept sitting up slightly, believing it was healthier or more godly. Full lying down was occasionally associated with death. Nighttime involved rituals, prayers, reading of psalms, and checking of charms. They too longed for dreams. They too reached, in the darkness, for something soft, and found only scratchy wool, but perhaps that's what makes the story of sleep so meaningful. It never belonged to comfort alone. It always belonged to us. Close your eyes. It's early morning in a medieval village. You are not yet fully awake, but you are already cold. The smell of ashes clings to your blanket, your hair, your hands. It always does. The hearth has gone out in the night again. You rise. No one rushes in this world. There is no clock on the wall, only the slow blue of dawn appearing through the wooden shutter. You must make breakfast. But there is no cupboard, no refrigerator, just the leftover pot from the night before, thin, sticky mix of barley, oats, and cabbage. It's time to warm the gruel. Welcome to the kitchen. A kitchen without a kitchen if you're imagining countertops, cupboards, or even walls. Pause that thought. Most medieval homes, especially among peasants and laborers, didn't have a kitchen in the way we know it. Cooking was usually done over an open hearth, built in the center of a dirt floor, or, in better houses, against a stone wall with a chimney. But chimneys were rare before the late 12th century. Many homes had only a smoke hole in the roof. The fire sat on a raised stone slab or a simple ring of rocks. Above it, the air was thick and black with soot. Smoke curled under the rafters for hours. It didn't escape quickly. It soaked into everything: wool, skin, lungs. Children played under the smoke. Chickens pecked at the corners. And always, in the pot, something simmered. That pot was the heart of the home. The pot that never stopped. Medieval kitchens revolved around one crucial principle. There was always something boiling. A large iron cauldron hung from a hook or tripod over the flame. This pot was never truly empty. Whatever was left from the last meal was left in, added to, thickened, and extended with whatever ingredients were on hand. This was known as a perpetual stew, or eternal pottage. It could last days, even weeks, constantly evolving. On Monday, it might begin as barley gruel with leeks. By Wednesday, a bit of stale bread and some salted pork is added. By Friday, it's thinner, again diluted to stretch the last spoonfuls. By Sunday, it might be closer to flavored water. And yet, it was nourishing, familiar, and for many, the only hot food they'd eat all week. Ingredients of necessity. Peasant meals weren't about flavor. They were about calories. The backbone of medieval food was grain, mostly in the form of pottage, a type of thick soup or stew, bread, and sometimes gruel. These grains could be oats, rye, barley, or buckwheat, depending on region and season. Vegetables were added when available. Onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, herbs like parsley or sage were used occasionally, but salt was precious and sometimes unobtainable. Meat was rare. A family might keep a pig or a few chickens, but pigs were slaughtered in autumn and preserved in salt. Chickens were kept for eggs. Killing one for food was a loss, so most meals were vegetarian by necessity. Milk might be consumed if cows or goats were available, but it soured quickly. Cheese was a safer storage method. Ale, not water, was often the safest thing to drink, because water, it could kill you. Especially near towns, rivers were often polluted by waste. People knew that bad water made them sick, even if they didn't understand why. So instead of tea or juice, you might have small beer or low alcohol, weak brew, consumed even by children. Imagine eating a spoonful of cold cabbage stew, followed by a sip of warm ale at sunrise. That was breakfast. Fire as a toolant, a threat. Cooking meant mastering fire, but fire could also destroy everything. Peasant homes were made of timber, wattle, and thatch. One spark in the wrong place could burn an entire village. It happened often, so tending the fire was a job in itself. You didn't let it go out if you could help it. Lighting it again, especially in winter, took time and skill. There were no matches, just flint, steel, and patience. Children were often taught early how to feed a fire properly. A pot too far from the flame stayed cold. Too close, and the stew burned, and burned stew meant wasted food. Ash was swept into piles near the hearth. Sometimes, it was used to clean things, mixed with sand to scrub wooden bowls, or used as an alkaline base in early soap making. Smoke, you lived with it. Your eyes stung, your nose ran. But without smoke, you had no warmth, no food, no life. Bread, the constant companion. Even the poorest homes had some form of bread, but not the fluffy white kind. Bread for peasants was dense, dark, and often coarse with bits of bran or grit. In some areas, bread was mixed with beans or even bark during bad harvests. Flour was precious. It was stored in wooden bins or cloth sacks and doled out carefully. Baking bread might happen once or twice a week. Communal ovens were used in many villages. Families paid a fee to use them, or owed labor to the local lord in exchange. A family's bread ration was sacred. It filled stomachs, stretched meals, and fed the fire when dry. And it spoiled quickly, so any surplus was dried, crumbled into pottage, or fed to animals. In wealthier homes, bread also had another purpose. It served as a plate. Trenchers, thick slices of stale bread were used as dishes, soaking up juices from meat or sauce. When the meal ended, the soggy bread was either eaten, thrown to dogs, or given to the poor. No dishwashing required. Utensils, or the lack thereof, forget forks. Most meals were eaten with fingers and wooden spoons. Knives were common but used for cutting, not a knife was personal. You carried it with you, like a wallet today. Plates were wooden or ceramic, cups were simple. A bowl might be shared among several family members. There was little ceremony to daily eating, just practicality. In fact, dinner time wasn't even fixed. Meals were dictated by labor. If you worked in the fields, you ate at sunrise, midday, and dusk. If you worked in town, you might get one main meal. There was no lunch break, just time to eat when work allowed. And the idea of treats or dessert, not unless it was harvest time, when apples or berries were plentiful. Even then, the fruit was usually dried or stewed, not eaten fresh. The smells of the medieval kitchen now. Let's return to your nose. It smells like cabbage, smoke, and ash, a bit of sour milk, maybe wet wool. You stir the pot, add a bit of yesterday's bread, and scrape the bottom to unstick the burned layer. The fire is too hot, the spoon is too short. You're already sweating, but this is the routine. You feed the stew, then you feed your family. A scoop for your husband, a scoop for your daughter, a scoop for the neighbor's child whose mother died last winter. Everyone eats, and no one says much. There is no feast, no indulgence, just warmth, calories. The hope it lasts until dusk. As the steam curls up and the chicken outside pecks at crumbs, you pause and wonder, is this what every day will be for the rest of your life? A pot, a spoon, and the same taste in your mouth, always just a little sour. You've seen the peasant pot. It's thin stew and simple hearth. But now we cross the manor gate. The wooden world fades behind us. Smoke still curls into the air. But it's the good kind, the rich kind, the kind that smells of roasting meat and warm bread baked in a clay oven built just for show. Welcome to the medieval noble's kitchen. But before you imagine opulence, pause. This is not Versailles. This is not golden cutlery and flowing wine. Even the finest medieval kitchens were places of labor, danger, and decay. The meals may be richer, but they were still served in a world that understood hunger intimately. Let's look behind the curtain, at the world of noble dining. The fire, the hierarchy, and the calculated show of plenty. Kitchens of the castle. The kitchen of a noble household was not tucked next to the dining room. In many manors and castles, the kitchen was separata, detached, structure, or wing. This was not an aesthetic decision, it was fire control. Kitchens burned down often. Stone walls, high ceilings, and massive fireplaces were the norm. Long spits hung over open flames. Cooks moved about in a rush of heat, smoke, and shouted orders. Some wore nothing above the waist during summer. The heat could blister skin. Dozens of servants worked in the average noble kitchen. Spit boys to turn the meat, pot washers, sauce makers, bakers, wood haulers, and a master cook who managed them all. Above even him was the steward, who managed the food stores and made sure every loaf, roast, and fig was accounted for. Waste was a crime. Theft could mean flogging. The kitchen ledger was as sacred as the family Bible. Ingredients of the elite nobles had access to variety, but not always abundance. Their larders held salted pork, smoked fish, sacks of imported spices, and wine by the barrel. Honey for sweets, almonds for sauces, and if they were very lucky, sugar imported from far lands. But fresh meat was still seasonal. Chickens were precious, geese, occasional cows were for milk, pigs were the staples slaughtered in winter, and salted or smoked. Fresh fruits and vegetables were common in summer. In winter they relied on preserved pears, dried apples, or pickled beets. Even noble diets were shaped by the harvest calendar. Most importantly, they had spices, pepper, cloves, saffron, ginger. These weren't just for taste, they were for status. To season your meat with cinnamon said, I can afford to trade with the East. And that mattered, because dining was performance. Meals were ceremonial. A noble's dinner was not private. It was staged. You sat at a high table, above your guests, beside your family. Dishes arrived not all at once, but in courses 2, 3, sometimes more. Between courses, servants offered warm water to. Food changed dramatically. In England, people ate mutton, ale, and leeks. In France, wine, duck, and rich sauces. In Italy, pasta, figs, and cheese. In Scandinavia, fish, berries, and rye bread. In the Islamic world of Spain, saffron rice, dates, and lamb stew. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was culture. It showed where you came from, what you believed, who you were loyal to. A Jew might avoid pork. A Christian fasted on Fridays. A Muslim refused wine. Meals became markers of identity, visible and powerful. Even in times of war, prisoners could be identified and sometimes spared or punished based on what they ate or refused to eat. The meal was a statement. It still is. Leftovers and the poor, and what about those at the edge? In towns and cities, poor families waited near castle gates and church doors not for charity, but for scraps. Leftover trencher soaked in gravy, bits of bread, cold stew. Some lords allowed it. Others made a show of distributing leftovers after a feast to demonstrate their virtue. But it wasn't enough. In bad years, the poor starved whole villages. Emptied fields went untended. Monasteries overwhelmed by beggars shut their doors. And yet, some survived on crusts, on turnips, on faith. Sometimes, that was the most powerful ingredient of all. The last taste? Let's return now to the silence of night. The fire is out. The bowl is empty. Your belly is full or not. A single spoon sits on the table, stained from years of use. The air smells faintly of onions and ash. A dog licks the corner where something spilled. You lean back, eyes heavy. Tomorrow, you'll wake and begin again. Another pot, another loaf, another effort to make enough. But for now, you sit quietly, remembering the tastes thin, warm, a little bitter, and you wonder, how many lives have passed this waiting gruel, one slow spoonful at a time and, never being remembered.